Our first speaker is Dr. Eshchar Mizrachi from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where he works in the Department of Biochemistry, Genetics, and Microbiology, and also is affiliated with the Forestry and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute. His research focuses on plants, plant genomics, how wood forms, how roots are assessing or accessing nutrients. And I would say he's broadly interested in plant diversity and evolution and complex traits. And he's recently been exploring the rich biodiversity of South Africa. Now, in addition to the work on plant biology, Esh is also very passionate about developing potential research talent in Africa, and he's involved in a number of science leadership programs, including the Africa Science Leadership Program and the Global Young Academy. And he's spearheaded a couple projects to bring together the bio and the creative economies to really explore the intersection between art and science. And yeah, without going on and on for too long, I would say that Esh is one of the most creative and forward-thinking scientists that I've had the pleasure of interacting with, and I always leave our conversations feeling very inspired and motivated. So I'm super excited to hear his talk today, and I hope that you guys will also walk away feeling inspired. So with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Esh. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Rose. No pressure. I don't remember giving you an introduction, so just thank you for the long introduction, very generous one. I'm going to try and share my screen and just, you'll have to tell me the okay because I can't see anyone now. Oh, I can. And can you see
Looks
it?
good. Yep.
Great. So I'm just going to start, hopefully stick to time. So thank you very much. My talk today is on what I'm calling ecocultural justice. We can debate the term later, but basically I'll just get straight to it. The talk today, I hope to be a kind of broad talk, maybe a little provocative, but also hopefully generating discussions and feedback. And feel free to contact me later for increasing collaboration and building on these ideas and even correcting me where I'm wrong. So all of this is a discussion. I'm going to talk about two main things today. The one is the culture of research and the consequences to plant innovation ecosystems, especially in the global south. And linked to that, I'm going to talk about, in my own country, in South Africa, the aesthetics and narrative of biodiversity as it's expressed in the creative economy. So I'll try and deal with both of these. I see these both as societally really important, one in the short to medium term and the other in the long term. But it's important to say that they're both interlinked, equally important and equally urgent. Sometimes it's difficult for us as researchers and people in different areas to explain to people that sometimes long-term things are still really urgent. So I feel both of these are. So let's start with the first one. Is actually basically talking about the culture of research and how it works in the global south, especially as pertaining to plant science, which is my field. So needless to say, and many might be familiar here or not, that the global north has several advantages. One of them is the researchers per million inhabitants. These are some stats from UNESCO, the most recent ones. And you can see the underrepresentation of just human resources, researchers actively working in the global south per million people. So that disparity exists. The investment in research exists. This is the world GDP investment in research and development. So you can see here North America and Western Europe. East Asia and the Pacific is somewhat skewed by a few countries. But here I really would like you to take note of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, for the reason that these are high biodiversity countries in terms of plants. A lot is here as well. And so a lot of this is impacting the kind of research that we'll be able to do on plants in the coming few decades. And so maybe to highlight this aspect that most of the world's biodiversity is not equally distributed, you get what are called these 17 megadiverse countries. And especially if we look at the plants, I take some statistics from a paper that looked at estimates of vascular plant species estimates in these 17 countries, without necessarily referring to these numbers. What you can see is that most of these countries, everyone other than United States, China, and Australia, are actually considered emerging or developing countries. And so this is a huge proportion of the world's plant species, including endemic and indigenous plants. And of course, there are research dynamics. I thought I'd talk about it broadly, just using kind of figures. So I'll talk about my own country, South Africa. We're about 60 million people. We have a GDP of around $420 billion. We're the best at something, which is we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world. So we are the most unequal country economically in the world. I say this sarcastically, of course, it's not something to be proud of. And our annual R&D spending is around 0.6 billion USD. So let's compare ourselves to a global north country that I'm sure is not controversial at all. This is a country that, so if we take the UK, it's about the same population, but a much higher GDP and also much higher proportionally R&D spending. So the thing to consider here is when it comes to plant biodiversity and how we do research, South Africa is probably fifth in the world or sixth for plant species. We have about 25,000 plant species, most of which are actually endemic, really high endemicity in some regions, as compared to the UK, which might have around 2,000 something plant species with about an 8% endemicity. And for context, 2,000 species is what you'd find on Table Mountain if you'd come to the UK, to South Africa, to Cape Town, except this would be about 80% endemicity in this region of these 2,200 plant species. The other important thing to say about the Global South is that it's absolutely not equal. South Africa is considered kind of more higher income than the average Global South country, but I can tell you that if you work in South Africa for the last year, we've had sometimes up to 12 hours of no electricity every day, which really impacts a lot of things. We can take a country like our neighbor Madagascar, which has 30 million people, but a much lower GDP, and of course, basically virtually no investment in R&D or spending. Sorry, there's a plane flying past. Madagascar has about 12,000 species and 90% endemicity. So when we look forward on how are we going to do plant research in the coming decades, who will benefit and how will it result, these are things to take into account because both of these are good representatives, South Africa and Madagascar, of many countries in Central and South America, Southeast Asia, and hotspots of biodiversity in the world. So maybe I should also say there is value of a plant genome to society, and I'll speak about this briefly, although many people might be familiar. If we want a plant genome, we need to sample the plant. We have to extract DNA, do DNA sequencing, assemble a genome, annotate it, find where the genes are. We have to analyze it, and then we can use that to do omic studies on plants. So this is kind of the value chain of generating a plant genome. But of course, the real value comes, especially when you're generating value for your economy. So first of all, it's fundamental research and discovery, but also applying these methodologies results in actual application to your country and your economy. So you have a high amount of science experts on genomics and plants, conservation, breeding, diagnostics, crop improvement. The list goes on of the value of these things to a society. And one of the issues in research is we've been calling some things, or maybe I should say this actually, is that there is value to just training people on this alone. Many people trained on this technologies in plant biodiversity and plant genomics end up going actually to the data science related fields because bioinformatics is a data science related field, especially in the Global South, or they go overseas where there's a lot more opportunities for these things. Most of these are present in the Global North at high numbers. And so the thing maybe that's not said is that the much higher value comes from having this. It also takes much more investment and long-term investment as well. And the most value comes from actually the application you get from an entire innovation ecosystem working on these things. And so this is, when we're doing research, this is what we're calling now helicopter science in the literature, is when someone from the Global South sends you a sample, and most of the work is done in the Global North, and most of the follow-up work and value from the plant would actually end up in the Global North. We've even started calling helicopter science setting up labs in the Global South and letting them extract, them being me as well, extract the DNA and then sending it to Global North partners because most of the facilities and everything and expertise sits there. But we're kind of not really decided and acknowledging as a research community that actually this is the thing that will bring value to the Global South. And building a sustainable research ecosystem that lasts many, many decades is actually what will bring equity and economic value to these countries. Continuing and perpetuating this will result in, a perpetuation of a system that's already unequal. And so now what you might find is words like empower or train or capacity development, with you training people in the Global South from the Global North. I don't say you to everyone, by the way. I'm speaking in generalities. And so you can train people to do sequencing and even assembly and even annotation, even take them up to here, but it's very difficult to support long-term an ecosystem of a country. This is something that involves government, the private sector, and many other things. So the main point I want to make here is that even with a lot of initiatives that you might see, like we're sequencing 1,000 genomes in South Africa, or we're sequencing 10,000 genomes of Africa, or 1 million genomes in the world, the bioeconomies that can benefit of this data are generally highly developed in the Global North. And we have about a 10, I estimate 10, 15-year window to develop these economies in the global south, which is currently very unlikely to happen. So we need to think of different solutions, both to do this research and to get the global south countries that contain this biodiversity to benefit from these ecosystems. So I'm a big fan of Rose as well, as she said, and she's published 2 landmark papers, which are really, what I like about them is that they're data-driven. They don't even have to be ethical or moralistic or whatever. They're making claims based on data. And this is really helping us see the situation in the world. And one of the big takeaways is in my field of plant genome sequencing, most of the genomes, if not all, were led outside of Africa, and almost none represent endemic African species. So just for the first part of my talk, I'll say some of the things that can be done about this, I think. This is an example of the Protea genome, which is our national flower in South Africa that was published out of my laboratory in collaboration with several others in South Africa and a laboratory in Belgium. So the Protea genome paper actually gave us some platform in terms of the press release that could be done about it by the university. And it also allowed me to communicate, it also got nice coverage from other avenues that are science related, but it also allowed me to get coverage from the press in the country. This is some coverage in newspapers and things like that. I did radio interviews. And so I got to communicate in multiple platforms the importance of genome sequencing and what this could be done and why our biodiversity is so important. So there is this aspect of actually acknowledging that even the research paper, and we actually said in the acknowledgements in the research paper, we said, we acknowledge that the king protea is a cultural icon of South Africa, and it's an emblem of, I won't read this whole thing, but the important thing is to say we actually dedicate the completion of this genome to all past, present, and future researchers working on, as well as peoples benefiting from South African biodiversity. And this is not an empty statement. I hope you'll agree with me that I'm trying to do my best to actually develop this ecosystem in South Africa. Many of us are, we're just not necessarily working on it together. And what does it mean practically? I give this example as a representation. In general, when you look at a plant genome paper from the Global South, it looks something like this, right? The author. So you have your corresponding author, and remember, this is just a representation of the Global North, Global South. I'm not making any claims towards the UK. This would be like the corresponding author and the first author, and this is the person that sampled the material. And I'm not saying we need all of it to be like this, but it would be nice if we could have more Global South-led research happening and more capacity being developed in the Global South. So this is an example of the Protea genome paper I was talking about. You have a South Africa institution is leading. The co-first authorship is from both labs in Belgium and South Africa, and this is not just serving a purpose. This is actually real. It was an equal co-authorship. And so this is a more kind of equitable representation of what it means to do a South African genome of a plant and study it, and what you're doing for the country. And as I mentioned, it's 3 laboratories in South Africa and 1 in Belgium. And again, this doesn't say anything about the diversity of the people working on it. We were still a fairly diverse team between us, multinationals and from different countries, representing about 5 countries out of 9 authors. You might make the argument also that this is true in the Global North, but that's less the point. The important thing is that this is actually more of how papers coming out of the Global South on endemic biodiversity start to look, I hope. The other thing I want to say is I've really been inspired by this book. Anyone who hasn't read it but cares about anything about ecology or systems, including economic systems and changing things, is I've stopped blaming individuals actually for problems and started really thinking in systems after reading Danella Meadows' stuff. She was decades ahead of her time, and it's still very highly applicable today. But just thinking of the whole concept of innovation ecosystems and trying to model why things are not working. There are local things, but there are things that are common to the Global South. And there are also mechanisms within our research ecosystem that perpetuate these systems of inequality. And so just as an example, in my own country, I've started modeling how does the government think it can benefit, what are the kind of things it wants, what kind of things need to happen to make those things happen. So how is this derived from plants? And also what are government bodies and national bodies that may be involved in producing this value? And also knowledge production. So it's very important to consider how the system exists. When I mapped this out, what I realized is that really a lot of these, so you can, if I can compare to the US, for example, this would be like the NREL laboratories, maybe Agricultural Research Council, this is our National Research Foundation, this is our Biodiversity National Institute. So these are important bodies in terms of the roles they play. And in some countries, all of the components of the system exist, but they don't work together and they don't even work within each other. And they're under-resourced and under kind of stimulated to work together towards one national picture. So it's important for us to understand systems, I think, in countries in the Global South, especially ones that have high biodiversity that can be benefit the society. I'll speak a little bit about this below, which is also adding the whole aspect of art, culture, and design to our value from biodiversity. That'll be the next part of the talk. So just to finish off, the second half, which is not really a half, we'll be talking about just some of the work around looking around for information about biodiversity made me realize things about how we are representing biodiversity in the country. So the term I use as a shorthand is ecocultural justice. And what I really mean is this intersection of ecological, economic, and cultural justice. And broadly, I'm talking about exclusion from or exploitation of nature and peoples. And I haven't exactly found the right word here. But if ideally it would just be nature peoples, but I'm struggling to explain it, so we can talk about it later as well. But the point is, I actually started looking from economy point of view, the bioeconomy and the creative economy. For those who don't know, the creative economy would be anything from the fashion industry to Hollywood to like anything that derives value from cultural or creative products, design, etc. So both the bioeconomy and creative economy benefit from nature. They represent nature. Sometimes they directly utilize nature, but the economy is being driven by a very utilitarian view of nature, right? So it's a resource for people, and also it's global free market economy. So it ends up being exploitative and exclusionary as a system, which means the rich get richer. That's essentially what it means, and it means perpetuation of exploitation, whether you're intending to or not. It's just the way the system is set up to run. And so it really got me thinking about how are we representing biodiversity in our country, and what does ecocultural injustice actually look like in South Africa? So one of the most obvious ways to show you is how South Africans live. This is a legacy of apartheid right now. So if the reason for many people living in townships or informal settlements that it might be just a road, this is an aerial photograph, by the way, so it might be just a road away from, as you can see, a lot higher wealth. Pre-apartheid, this used to be white people and black people, and now this might be 50-50 white, black, and black. So we've had a change in demographic, we've had a change in some of the economic empowerment of some people, but all in all, our injustices stay very much the same for a large majority of the population. And the thing to think about is these are also young children growing up, brains that are not being exposed to nature, people that don't get to connect with nature, and also some of the people that might be signing conservation policy in a few decades. And South Africa is not unique in looking like this in terms of the global south. It's a bit of an extreme case, but it really is often a representation of how things look. Another thing is, we as South Africa have done an amazing job of actually describing our biodiversity. So we have these incredible books. These are 2 of thousands of books generated that are knowledge about our plants in South Africa and our biodiversity. But some of the problem are that it's botanical language, it's aimed at scientists, it's in book format, it's relatively high cost. This will definitely not sit on the average South African bookshelf at home. And so this comes to speak of cultural capital. What are people growing up with? What are they exposed to? What are they taking an interest in from a young age? And what do they value? There's also a bit, this being an exception, there's a lack of representation of indigenous knowledge. And also it's present in English and maybe in Afrikaans. And we have 11 official languages. English is not the primary language of most people growing up in South Africa. And so the time by which you're exposed to information about biodiversity will be very, very late in your life, which I think is just a recipe for disaster. The second aspect is noticing then, how is biodiversity represented in South Africa in the creative economy? And this is an example, if you look at fynbos art or protea, which is our national flower, the art, this is a very popular kind of thing in our creative economy. This is a pillow in my house, and it's very common in South African household. But it's not common in all South African households. It represents a fairly botanical colonial style still. And my problem with it is not what it aesthetically represents by itself. It's that really we have a single narrative that's actually representing our biodiversity. And we're missing opportunities to engage many more South Africans and have many more South Africans speak a more pluralistic version of our biodiversity to connect with it in different ways in the creative economy. So this is, to me, is a representation of something that presents both a problem and an opportunity in how we do. The third thing is actually looking at branding then. So we name things after our biodiversity. In South Africa, protea is a popular motif, and you might get quite a few people being attracted to your company, even if it's protea chemicals or protea engineering or whatever, because it unites us as a people. But we don't, I don't think anywhere in the world, make a lot of effort to say, what does it mean when you're actually branding something based on nature, and how is that feeding back into nature? So this is a discussion about values. I feel there would be an irony if I called a company Protea Mining and went and destroyed the fynbos, which is the biome of where proteas grow. We haven't connected these checks and balances on what eventually ultimately has economic value. And the last example I want to use is actually something which really is an intersection of the bio and creative economy. So for those who are familiar with Lego, this is the Lego strelitzia, the bird of paradise flower, which is endemic to South Africa. This is Lego's flagship botanicals product. It was designed by a Canadian guy, and it's sold in South Africa for about $100 to $150, which is basically inaccessible to almost all South African children. So I bought it for my children to make this point. But the point is, here's my son holding it next to a real one in our garden, and me getting to teach. Of course, I'm a plant scientist, so he learns more than the average child, but still. My point is 99.99% of South African children won't get to build this Lego. Instead, this will be built in the global north by people who can afford it. And so it's not the guy's fault he's Canadian. Seems like a nice guy. And it's certainly not Lego's fault that they're Danish. But there is an injustice committed here in terms of who gets to engage with South African biodiversity and grow up passionate about it, including all the other benefits you gain from Lego itself and all of that. So a point to make about that as well. So I've just given a few examples to give you an idea of what are the kind of things. There's a longer talk I can direct you to at the end, but I think that looking at computer gaming industry and a lot of things, a representation of biodiversity as well, is a big thing, both to talk about as a problem and a potential solution to a lot of the challenges we face. And another solution I've started seeing is actually representing our indigenous biodiversity and endemic biodiversity in South African cultural styles. This is an example in my botanical garden in Pretoria of art styles that's Ndebele style, which is one of the kind of cultures we have here in South Africa. It's the artistic and aesthetic style representing endemic South African species. And I think there's huge potential here for commercial empowerment of people. Now, remember, there's also huge potential for exploitation of people and of nature by producing these products. So we have to think, how do we responsibly actually build up economies using this in a way that benefits both people and nature of these countries? And I should finish off now. So just to say, I've also done a number of kind of workshops where we engage with people in powerful positions. These are leaders in the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa. And this is, we took a lot of endemic plant species. We did a whole day's function where we basically said, so these are people in charge of different aspects of developing industries in the country. And we set them this question: how do we unlock new economies through the lens of biodiversity, sustainability, unique South African culture, empowering youth and elder wisdom, and building industries of the future? And the things they came back with after this day of facilitation and engagement with them was just incredible. And I think the message here is, if you can access positions of intermediate power, less important than a minister or a president sometimes, it might actually be people who are working at these levels, is to change the value system of how they start to look at biodiversity in the country. And just very last thing, that I've partnered with the South African Creative Industries Incubator, which represents a lot of people working in the creative economy in South Africa. And we then partnered with Constitution Hill. These are actually the two CEOs of these organizations in a photo. Constitution Hill is an old South African apartheid prison. So Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu, Albertina Sisulu, many of our struggle heroes in South Africa were actually, the jail cells are still there, and it's a historical site. And what we did was we actually commissioned 20 visual artists and 10 animators and bloggers. This was a competitive process. And we picked 30 people to actually create a mural in this location, focusing on ecocultural justice, this theme of how do South Africans benefit from the biodiversity and how are voices represented in the creative economy. And I'll send you some links to these, but really we're going to launch this in in the next 2 weeks because it's just recently finished. But basically the response from the artists was transformational. And I really have met a whole new community. Now there's a WhatsApp group. There's a lot of links being sent of new opportunities. They have received some employment benefits as a result. And so I think we're starting to build a community of people that are thinking about biodiversity as a theme for the creative economy, and also an opportunity to represent and connect our people to nature. And just the very last point, and I'm sorry if I'm over time, we also have several urban gardening and urban farming initiatives. So urban agriculture and agrobiodiversity become incredibly important to both feed local populations that might benefit off this. A lot of the way we do agriculture actually, it costs a lot of money to people who really could grow their own food if we could. And so we have these ideas for like giving gardens at different locations where people can take plants and grow in their own gardens and community garden together. But part of the opportunity here, and we have several locations in the country now, is to start planting indigenous species. So both as kind of green pharmacies to kind of save money on that, and food and education. And this QR code is a really magical thing when it comes to these things. My idea is actually to translate all of these books into biodiversity into like South African languages. So if we have a garden in Durban, we can have most of the information in Zulu, for example, or a language that's more relevant to the area. And we can also then train a kind of AI chatbot to kind of deal with this and then put QR codes in physical spaces. So we're linking physical, virtual, and a whole lot of environment for people to be able to engage with it. That's kind of the long-term vision of that. So basically, just to finish off, the whole thing has to do with indigenous plant omics as a research, but really it's about research, innovation, ecosystems, and linking a lot of expertise that's already sitting in the country, just not working together for various reasons. I really think that this is an important aspect in many countries in the global south that are culturally diverse and biodiverse, to give more pluralistic voices to the biodiversity, to be able to then connect more people to nature. And I do see urban gardens as being stewards of agrobiodiversity and opportunities for these things. I hope that explained everything. And thank you very much. I understand there'll be a recording. So these are links to 3 other talks if you're interested in more things about this. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Esh, for a wonderful talk.